The smoke comes first. Always the smoke. Private First Class James Calloway of the 30th Infantry Division pressed his back against the stone wall of a Norman farmhouse and tried to remember how to breathe. His hams, 19 years old, already trembling from 48 hours without sleep, cracked at the knuckles from the cold that persisted even in August, gripped the wooden stock of his M1 Garand so hard the grain pressed white imprints into his palms. The farmhouse smelled of old manure and wet plaster and something else beneath it all. Something the veterans never named out loud. Something metallic and sweet. Then the sound reached him. Not the artillery. Then the sound reached him. Not the artillery. Then the sound reached him. Not the dry crack of rifle fire from the tree line 60 yards east. Not the stuttering of a German MG-42 chewing through another hedgerow. This was different. A rhythmic, grinding thunder that seemed to originate in the earth itself, traveling up through the soil, through the stone foundation, through the soles of his boots and into his spine before it ever reached his ears. He had heard it described once in a replacement depot in England by a sergeant with a jaw like a closed fist and eyes that had already seen Kasserine Pass in Italy and 2 other places the man never named. The sergeant had gone very quiet and said only 3 words. You'll know it. He knew it. The tiger. I emerged from the morning mist like something assembled in hell and shipped express to France. 57 tons of Krupp steel, its 88mm barrel traversing slowly left, then right, with the disinterested patience of a predator that has never once feared being the prey. Its frontal armor, 100mm of face-hardened steel angled to compound the protection further, had already shrugged off 3 rounds from American M5 anti-tank guns that morning at a range where those guns should have been lethal. The crews of those guns were not here anymore. The Tiger's commander rode half-exposed in his cupola, scanning the village through his binoculars, and he was not afraid. He had every mathematical reason not to be. In North Africa, at Kasserine Pass, along the Rapido River in Italy, and now in every sunken lane and apple orchard of the Norman Bocage, a single Tiger tank had proven capable of destroying an entire American armored platoon before the engagement reached its 5th minute. Its 88mm gun could penetrate the armor of a Sherman tank at ranges exceeding 2,000 meters, distances at which the Sherman's own gun could barely scratch a Tiger's paint. The calculus of steel favored Germany absolutely. By any rational analysis, the man in that cupola should have been terrified of nothing on this field. He scanned the village, he saw the crumbled wall, he saw a French farmhouse with a blown-in roof. He did not see the 2 men crouched in the ditch 10 feet to Calloway's left, who had spent the last 20 minutes crawling through mud and broken glass to reach an angle his tank could not cover. He did not see the canvas unwrapped with practiced mechanical calm from the tube resting on the closer man's shoulder. He did not see that Calloway's hands had stopped shaking. The Germans had been studying the American army for 2 years. They knew about the Sherman. They knew about American artillery. They knew about the air power that came when the weather was clear, what no intelligence report had ever prepared him for. What no briefing in the Panzer training schools of 1944 had covered in sufficient detail was that the Americans had stopped fighting the Tiger. They had started hunting it. Most people who tell this story talk about tanks. They talk about the Sherman versus the Tiger, about the metallurgical gap between German precision engineering and American mass production, about how it took, on average, 5 Sherman tanks to kill 1 Tiger, and what that arithmetic meant for the young men inside those Shermans. That story is true. It is real. It is terrible. And it is not the story we are telling today. This video is not about armor plate. It is not about muzzle velocity, or engine horsepower, or the thickness of steel at 60 degrees of slope. It is about something far more dangerous than any of those things. It is about what happens when an entire army, from its commanding generals down to its 19-year-old riflemen in the mud, decides, systematically and with institutional fury, to stop fighting the enemy's weapon and start destroying the entire system that makes that weapon possible. By the end of this video, you will understand why the Tiger tank, the most feared ground weapon of the Second World War, the machine that haunted Allied tank crews from Tunisia to the Rhineland, was ultimately defeated not by a better tank, not by superior firepower, not by numbers alone. It was defeated by American infantry, by doctrine, by a system so adaptive and so lethal that it turned the Tiger's greatest strengths into liabilities. System versus hardware. The most important war inside the war that almost nobody talks about. To understand what the American military became by 1944, you must first understand, without mercy, what it was in 1943. Because the distance between those two things is the real story of this war, and you cannot appreciate the destination without standing in the wreckage of where it started. On the morning of February 19, 1943, the United States Army met the German war machine in full, open, combined arms battle for the first time in the European theater. The encounter lasted roughly 48 hours. It was a humiliation so complete that its aftershocks were felt in Washington, in London, and in every field manual that the American Army produced for the next 18 months. The Kasserine Pass sits in the Atlas Mountains of western Tunisia, a narrow throat of rock and pale desert scrub that connects the coastal plains to the high plateau country beyond. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel had identified it with the precision of a surgeon choosing an incision, drive through Kasserine, collapse the American rear areas, trap the British Eighth Army in a vice between two German forces, and end the North African campaign before the Allies could recover. On paper, it was elegant. In execution, over the first 3 days, it was something close to a massacre. The tie of corps of the United States Army, green, overconfident after minor tactical successes earlier in the campaign, and critically dispersed across a frontage no single corps could responsibly hold, simply did not understand what was coming. Their commanders had arranged their forces in isolated packets, ignoring the fundamental doctrine of mass. Their artillery battalions operated independently, each supporting its own sector, incapable of concentrating fires. Their infantry and armor worked in separate worlds, each branch fighting its own private war with no joint coordination, no common language, no shared situational picture. Meanwhile, the Africa Corps, which had been conducting combined arms battle since September 1939, executed the assault with a smooth, practiced efficiency of professionals doing work they had done 100 times before. The first German assault struck at 0400 hours on February 19th. By 09, the 168th Infantry Regiment of the 34th Division had been enveloped on 3 sides and was in full disarray. Officers lost contact with their units within the first hour. Radios were abandoned. Men who had never heard incoming artillery in their lives ran from positions they had been ordered to defend to the last. The 1st Armored Division's Combat Command A, sent forward to counterattack, blundered directly into a German minefield and then into a coordinated anti-tank screen that the Germans had established precisely where American doctrine dictated the counterattack would come. In less than 2 hours of fighting, Combat Command A lost over 100 tanks. 100 tanks. An entire armored command, destroyed in a single morning by an enemy who had read the American playbook before the Americans had finished writing it. By February 22nd, German forces had pushed through Kasserine and were threatening to unravel the entire Allied position in North Africa. More than 6,000 American soldiers sat in German prisoner-of-war enclosures, many of them still confused about exactly what had happened. Rommel himself inspected the captured American equipment and wrote to his wife with a candor that bordered on contempt. The enemy is definitely superior to us in artillery and numbers of tanks, but their infantry is not yet capable of serious resistance. Back home in the parlors and church basements and small-town diners of the United States, the news arrived in fragments. Delayed by censors, softened by editors, shaped into something a population accustomed to winning could absorb. But it arrived. In Richmond, Virginia, a woman named Eleanor Harmon pressed a newspaper photograph of destroyed American half-tracks against her chest and stood at the kitchen window without speaking for a long time. Her son was with the 1st Armored Division. She had not heard from him in 9 days. She would not hear for 11 more. Gold Star banners began appearing in windows across 30 states. Radio announcers cleared their throats before morning casualty reports in a way that American families had learned, in the space of a few weeks, to recognize as a signal to sit down. General Harold Alexander, commanding 18th Army Group, sent a report to Winston Churchill that was blunt to the point of cruelty. American soldiers were inferior in training, inferior in tactical coordination, and lacking in fighting spirit compared to both their German enemies and their British allies. The report circulated through Whitehall. It reached Washington. It sat on desks in the War Department like an accusation. And in February of 1943, it was almost completely accurate. The American soldier at Kasserine Pass was not a coward. He was confused, isolated, poorly led, inadequately trained, and equipped with weapons and doctrine that had never been tested against a real enemy operating at full capability. He had been handed a rifle, told he was ready, and sent to fight men who had been doing this for 3.5 years. He was not ready. Neither was the army around him. But here is what Rommel, for all his tactical genius, failed to fully account for. America had something he did not, something no battle map could capture. They had the capacity, the cultural, institutional, almost stubborn American capacity, to look at a disaster with completely clear eyes, to quantify the failure without excuse or evasion, and to build something specifically, mercilessly engineered to make sure it never happened again. The question was, who would do the building, and how long it would take. On March 6, 1943, Lieutenant General George S. Drosdes Patton arrived at II Corps headquarters in Tebessa, Algeria, and the atmospheric pressure in the room shifted. Patton was not subtle. He was not a diplomat. He did not hold town halls or circulate suggestion forms. He walked through the headquarters compound, and what he saw filled him with contempt. Officers without helmets, soldiers lounging in the back of jeeps with their collars unbuttoned, a staff that had grown comfortable in the particular way of organizations that have absorbed defeat and begun to mistake survival for adequacy. He issued a general order within hours. Helmets would be worn at all times, in all areas, under all circumstances. Neckties would be worn in the field. Neckties would means dacty. Violations of uniform standards carried cash fines, actual monetary penalties, deducted from pay. His staff privately wondered if he had arrived already mad. He had not arrived mad. He was doing something far more calculated than disciplined theater. He was making a declaration that every man in II Corps, from the senior staff officer to the cook, could understand without a briefing. The version of this army that lost at Kasserine does not exist anymore. We have buried it. We are something else now, and we are going to act like it, starting with whether your collar is buttoned. But Patton's work was the surface renovation. The deeper revolution was architectural. It was happening in the tactical schools, in the after-action review committees, in the working groups of colonels and sergeants and ordnance engineers who were pulling apart every failure at Kasserine and rebuilding what they found there into something that would never fail in the same way twice. And at the center of that reconstruction was a single, cold insight. You cannot fight the tiger on the tiger's terms. The tiger, was the product of German engineering philosophy at its most unapologetic, a weapon designed for the decisive encounter, the head-on confrontation, the moment when two opposing forces meet in open terrain and the better machine wins. Its 88mm Qua 36 gun could destroy any Allied tank at any practical combat range. Its 100mm frontal armor made it immune to the standard American 75mm anti-tank gun at all but point bing-bling and it. In a straight fight, two lines of vehicles converging across open ground, the Tiger would win. The math was not ambiguous. So American military doctrine began, quietly and with great deliberateness, redefining what a straight fight was. The first pillar of the new American approach was artillery, specifically the radical centralization of fire direction that transformed American guns from a collection of independent assets into a single, coherent weapon that could be aimed by one voice from anywhere on the battlefield. Before Tunisia, American field artillery operated in fragments, each battalion supporting its own sector, responding to requests through chains of command that added minutes to every fire mission. After Tunisia, the Army systematized the direct support relationship between forward observers and centralized fire direction centers. A single sergeant lying in a ditch with a radio could now, within 2 to 4 minutes, bring the massed fires of an entire artillery division down onto a coordinate ordinate. The German tank commander who thought he had identified and neutralized the threats in his sector had no way of knowing that 9 artillery battalions had just been handed his position. The second pillar was air-ground integration. Working in close coordination with the IX Tactical Air Command, American ground forces developed the close air support protocols that would eventually produce the most lethal aviation-infantry partnership of the war. Republic P-47 Thunderbolts, each carrying 8.5 caliber machine guns, 5-inch high-velocity aircraft rockets, and 500-pound bombs, were placed in continuous radio contact with ground commanders through forward air controllers who moved with the lead elements. When a Tiger appeared, you did not engage it frontally and accept the losses. You fixed it in place, reported its position, and waited. Within minutes, the sky became a weapon aimed specifically at that tank. The third pillar was institutional learning, the systematic, mandatory, ruthlessly honest after-action review process that the Army began building into its standard operating procedure after the Tunisian campaign. Every engagement was analyzed. Every failure was documented, circulated, and studied without the protective softening of organizational ego. Every tactical innovation that worked, however improvised, however accidental its discovery, was captured, tested, and distributed through the training system within weeks. The American military became, by 1944, the fastest-learning large organization in the history of organized warfare. The Germans were innovative too, brilliantly so. But German innovation traveled upward through a hierarchy that often strangled it before it reached the men who needed it. American innovation traveled horizontally, through signal wire and field manuals, and the informal networks of sergeants and junior officers who talked to each other across unit boundaries. And the fourth pillar, the one that would ultimately terrify the Tiger crews more than any of the others, was infantry anti-tank doctrine, the systematic, patient, training-intensive project of teaching American foot soldiers not to run from tanks, but to hunt them. To understand a tank's fundamental vulnerabilities, the dead zones where the commander cannot see, the moments of blind exposure when a tank crests a rise or crosses a ditch and its belly flashes naked to the world, the angles of approach that put the shooter against the thinner armor of the sides and rear, the exposed exhaust grills and the tracks and the vision blocks and the thin steel of the engine deck. The bazooka, the M1A1 rocket launcher, 2.5 inches of tube firing a 2.5-pound shaped charge, was not a tank killer at the ranges the manuals initially suggested. American infantry discovered in the bitter school of Tunisia and Italy that the bazooka was a devastatingly effective weapon at 10 to 30 yards, fired from an angle, by a 2-man team that had maneuvered into position through ground the tank could not watch. The trick was never about the weapon. The trick was about the ground, the patience, and the willingness to get close enough that fear became irrelevant because there was no time for it. These 4 pillars did not emerge from genius at a desk in Washington. They emerged from grief. From the grief of Kasserine, from 6,000 prisoners, from Gold Star banners and the particular silence of a military organization that has looked at its own failure without flinching and decided, in the cold and specific language of soldiers, what it is going to do about it. By the summer of 1944, the machine was built. It needed proving. The first roof came in the Tunisian desert before the ink had dried on the new doctrine, and it was not supposed to be a contest worth studying, but it was. On the morning of March 23, 1943, 17 days after Patton's arrival, Major General Terry Allen's 1st Infantry Division, the Big Red One, occupied a series of defensive positions east of El Geta, a small railway junction in a valley flanked by the Jebel Mekeltat Ridge and the flat salt flats of the Chatsida. They were holding ground. The Germans had ordered the 10th Panzer Division, over 50 tanks, fully motorized infantry, mobile artillery, to break through, destroy the American positions, and push onto the Allied supply lines beyond. The 10th Panzer was not a garrison force or a reserve formation. It was one of the premier armored divisions in the Afrika Korps, with veteran crews and commanders who had been fighting combined arms battles since Libya. They came at 0630 hours in the classic German penetration formation, concentrated, fast, aimed at what German intelligence had identified as the seam between American defensive sectors, where coordination would be slowest and the reaction most confused. What they found was different from anything they had encountered against Americans before, and different from anything their intelligence had suggested they would encounter. Allen had not positioned his anti-tank guns in the obvious defensive sites. He had placed them in the broken ground to the flanks, angled to engage the advancing German armor in enfilade, from the side, where the armor was thinner and the shot geometry was lethal at ranges the German commanders had not calculated into their attack plan. His artillery, 4 battalions operating for the first time from a single coordinated fire direction center, had spent the previous day pre-registering every approach route, every wadi, every road junction. His forward observers were on the ridge lines before first light, radios warm, grids memorized. When the 10th Panzer advanced, Allen's guns did not wait for them to close the range. The artillery opened in time-on-target concentration. Multiple batteries firing calculated to arrive simultaneously rather than sequentially, and it hit the German formation at the moment of maximum exposure in the open ground. German tank commanders who had operated against American artillery that announced itself fired once and then fell silent as it displaced, now found American artillery that neither announced itself in advance nor displaced, now found American artillery that neither announced itself in advance. It simply kept arriving, walking with their formation, finding the infantry riding on the outside of the tanks, finding the half-tracks, finding the gaps. By 0900, the 10th Panzer had lost 30 tanks. By midday, they had withdrawn from the valley. Their commander, General Freiherr von Broich, wrote in his evening situation report a sentence that would have seemed impossible 3 weeks earlier. The American infantry did not break. They did not withdraw. This is new. It was new. And the Americans were only beginning to learn what they had made. 14 months later, in the high summer of Normandy, the machine faced its most demanding crucible. Not on open desert terrain where artillery and range could compensate for tactical inexperience, but in the bocage. The hedgerows of Normandy are not the decorative garden hedges of English imagination. They are earthen embankments built over centuries, some of them 5 feet tall and 10 feet thick, their roots interlocked with stone, their summits tangled with growth so dense it stopped light. They turned every Norman field into a separate fortification, and every sunken lane into a potential grave. American tanks could not penetrate them without climbing the embankment and exposing their thin belly armor to anyone waiting in the next field with a Panzerfaust. American infantry attacking across the crests of these embankments were silhouetted against the sky for the 3 or 4 seconds it took a German MG-42 gunner to adjust his aim and fire a burst. Entire divisions ground to a halt in these fields. 100 yards of advance might cost 50 men. 200 yards might cost 100. German Tiger and Panther tanks used the bocage with clinical efficiency, backing into gaps in the embankments, hull down and nearly invisible, waiting for American armor to expose itself on the approach before opening fire at distances of less than 200 yards. At that range, and in those conditions, the Tiger was essentially invulnerable. It could not be flanked because there were no flanks. It could not be spotted from the air because the hedgerow canopy concealed it from above. and it could not be engaged frontally by any weapon in the American armored inventory. Then, in the last week of July 1944, three things happened at once. Operation Cobra, Omar Bradley's breakout plan designed to shatter the German front west of Saint-Lô and pour American armor through the gap before the enemy could react, opened on July 25th with a carpet bombing that erased the German forward defenses across a 6-mile front. But before the bombs fell, something equally decisive had already happened in the maintenance areas and workshop parks of the 2nd Armored Division and the 29th and 30th Infantry Divisions. A 23-year-old sergeant named Curtis G. Cullen Jr. had welded 4 prongs of German beach obstacle steel to the front of a Sherman tank and demonstrated that the result could punch directly through a hedgerow embankment at 8 miles an hour, instead of climbing over it and exposing its belly. Cullen was not an engineer. He was a reconnaissance man from Chicago who had worked as a cab driver before the Army found him. He had attended a command-level frustration meeting about the bocage problem in early July 1944, heard an enlisted man joke that what they needed was tusks like a rhinoceros, and gone to work the next morning with a cutting torch and a pile of steel that the Nazis had installed at Utah Beach to kill Americans on D-Day. He welded the first prototype less than a day. It worked perfectly. General Omar Bradley saw the demonstration and said 4 words, "Get me 500. They built 500. They built 510 days, fitted to approximately 60% of the Shermans in the breakout force, and told no one outside the operation. When Cobra launched and American Shermans began punching through hedgerows rather than climbing over them, the German commanders in their camouflaged positions heard the assault coming and prepared for the angles of approach that experience had taught them to expect. The Americans came from directions that had not existed before. The tactical landscape of Normandy had been physically modified in 10 days by a cab driver with a welding torch and the institutional ability to recognize a good idea and mass-produce it immediately. But it was at the village of Mortain in the first days of August 1944 that American infantry anti-tank tactics were tested at their absolute limit and held. Hitler had ordered Operation Lüttich, a massive counterattack by 5 panzer divisions aimed at driving to the coast of Avranches, cutting the supply lines of Patton's newly operational Third Army and trapping the entire American breakout force east of the breakthrough. If it succeeded, it would be one of the most consequential reversals of the war in the West. It struck directly into the positions of the 30th Infantry Division, Old Hickory, dug into the high ground around Mortain in the early morning hours of August 7th. The assault was spearheaded by the 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich, one of the finest armored formations in the German order of battle, with Tiger tanks and experienced crews who had fought from Russia to Italy. They came in darkness and heavy fog. The fog was intentional. It grounded Allied air support and removed the one asset that had made German armored operations in Normandy consistently lethal. In the fog, the Tigers were invisible from above. Their thermal advantage was gone. Their range advantage was compressed by low visibility. The conditions were as close to ideal for the German attack as any field commander could have arranged. The 30th Division bazooka teams went to work in the dark, operating in pairs, moving through the fog-filled ditches and sunken lanes using the lane-by-lane fire and movement techniques they had drilled for months. American infantry anti-tank teams began working the flanks of the German armored columns, not fighting the Tigers at the front, crawling around them, staying low and patient, seeking the angles, the exposed side armor, the rear deck above the exhaust, the tracks on broken cobblestone. Throughout the night and into August 7th, the 120th Infantry Regiment of the 30th Division held Hill 314, a critical observation post, completely surrounded, cut off from resupply and reinforcement, under continuous assault from German infantry that the Tiger crews depended on to clear the American teams from the close terrain. They held that hill for 7 days. From Hill 314, with a single functioning radio, Their forward observers directed American artillery fire with such precision that the German armored columns in the valleys below were channeled, funneled, and systematically destroyed. When the fog burned off on August 8th and the P-47s arrived in waves, they found a battlefield that American infantry, completely isolated, with no air and minimal artillery support, had already shaped into a killing ground. Operation Lüttich collapsed. 3 of the 5 attacking panzer divisions were shattered beyond immediate recovery. The SS Panzer Corps lost over 130 tanks in 5 days of fighting. The 30th Infantry Division, which had absorbed the initial blow of the Wehrmacht's supreme counterattack effort in the West, had not merely survived, it had won decisively. General Omar Bradley's message to the 30th Division's commander, Leland Hobbs, arrived at the latter's headquarters that afternoon. It contained a single word: magnificent. Behind every doctrine, there are hands that made it real. Sergeant Curtis G. Cullen Jr. had never imagined, driving a cab through Chicago traffic before the war, that the most useful skill he would bring to the battlefields of France was his ability to solve immediate mechanical problems with whatever materials were at hand. He was not introspective about it. At the meeting where his prototype hedgerow cutter was proposed, he said very little. He let the device speak. When General Bradley turned from the demonstration and ordered 500 units built, Cullen went back to his unit and resumed his regular duties. He received the Legion of Merit. He survived the war. He went back to driving a cab in Chicago. When people asked what he had done in the war, he told them he had worked in vehicle maintenance. He was not wrong. The men who died in the Bocage in June and July 1944, before the Rhino cutters existed, climbing hedgerows in silhouette while German machine gunners adjusted their fire, had no similar answer to give. On Hill 314 at Mortain, Staff Sergeant Robert Garneau of the 120th Infantry Regiment spent the night of August 7th doing what infantry sergeants do when the tactical situation has no good options. He kept his men organized, his position defensible, and his wounded alive. He was 22 years old, from Macon, Georgia, and he had been in France for 43 days. He had a letter from his mother folded in his breast pocket, its paper softened from rereading to the consistency of cloth. He did not read it on August 7th. He was occupied when the relief column broke through to Hill 314 on the morning of August 12th. Garneau was standing at his position, still armed, the perimeter his squad had 5 days reduced by casualties but intact. He had no food. He had been drinking water from a shell crater for 2 days. When the medic who came with the relief column moved toward him, Garneau stepped aside and pointed to the men on the ground. "See to them first," he said. "I can still walk." He would walk with a slight limp for the rest of his life from a piece of German mortar casing that had passed through the muscle of his left calf on August 9th. He never mentioned it in any official report. The limp was the only record. Across the Mortain Valley, in the smoldering wreckage of what had been a Das Reich armored column, lay the disabled tiger of SS Hauptsturmführer Ernst Krag. His tank had not been destroyed by another tank. It had not been destroyed by another tank. It had not been killed by artillery. It had been disabled by a shaped charge rocket fired from a range of roughly 12 yards, from an angle the tank's commander had not identified as a threat, by an American soldier who had spent approximately 40 minutes crawling through a drainage ditch to achieve that angle. Krag survived, badly burned about the arms and face, and was taken prisoner and transported to an American field hospital. A medical officer, tending his burns, asked him in imperfect German what had happened. Krag was silent for a long moment. Then he answered in careful English that surprised everyone in the room. "Your infantry," he said, with the particular precision of a man choosing his words rather than letting them choose themselves, "does not fight as infantry. They fight as hunters. We were not prepared to fight hunters. We were not prepared to fight hunters." In the village of Mortain itself, freed on August 13th after a week of German occupation, A 51-year-old Frenchwoman named Hélène Demon walked through the rubble of her family's bakery, the bakery her grandfather had built, that had survived the First War and the Depression and the occupation and 5 days of artillery, and found in the ruins, intact and inexplicable amid the broken stone and scorched flour sacks, a single American helmet. Inside the liner, in ink that had bled at the edges, T. Briggs. She did not know if T. Briggs was alive or dead. She kept the helmet. When the first American soldiers came through Mortain that afternoon, she stood in the ruined doorway and pressed it into the hands of the first one she reached. She did not have the English words for what she meant. The soldier was 19 years old. He had not slept in 3 days. He looked at the name on the liner, and his face changed. He pressed the helmet against his chest and stood in the street and cried, not quietly, not with composure, but the way exhausted young men cry when the accumulated weight of the past week suddenly finds no more resistance. Nobody said a word. Some things do not require words, but the machine had not yet been fully tested against the best Germany could send. Not until September 1944 in the farm country of Lorraine. The fields east of Nancy are nothing like Normandy. There are no hedgerows here, no ancient embankments, no claustrophobic corridors of stone and root. This is open plateau country, rolling exposed, the kind of terrain where armor can see at distance, where range becomes everything again, where the tiger's fundamental advantages are restored. And on September 18, 1944, it was onto this terrain that the German army sent 5 fresh panzer brigades with orders to shatter the 4th Armored Division of Patton's Third Army and demonstrate that Germany's summer of retreat was over. The brigades were equipped with Panther tanks, in many ways more dangerous than the Tiger in mobile warfare, with a longer range gun and superior cross-country mobility. Their crews were fresh from Germany, trained for exactly this kind of open-country armored battle. The plan was sound. The terrain favored the attacker, and on the morning of September 19th, a thick fog settled across the Lorraine plateau that grounded every American aircraft within range. General Hasso von Manteuff, that counterattack, had timed the assault for precisely this kind of weather. He had studied the American way of war carefully enough to know that close air support was now its most lethal component. Take the air away, and you had something manageable. You had tanks and artillery and infantry, and Germany was still very good at those things. He was correct about the fog. He was wrong about almost everything else. The 4th Armored Division's combat commands under Brigadier General John Wood had occupied the high ground around the small town of Aricourt and established interlocking fire plans before the Germans arrived. Their forward observers were in position before first light. Their tank destroyer platoons, M18 Hellcats, faster than any German tank alive and carrying a gun that could kill a Panther from the side, had been placed at road junctions and reverse slope positions that controlled the avenues of German approach. And their P-47 liaison officers were on the ground with their radios, engines running on the airfield 16 miles west, waiting for a gap in the ceiling. The German Panther formations came out of the fog and drove into American fire. Shermans, individually still outgunned, still vulnerable at the ranges the Panther preferred, operated in coordinated teams, each tank covering the other's blind sectors, rotating to maintain suppressive fire while adjacent elements worked for flanking angles. Individual Shermans were hit and burned. Their crews died. But for every Sherman that burned, the American system produced a consequence. Another angle of fire opened, another artillery mission was called, another tank destroyer shifted position. The German commanders, trained to identify a decisive point and concentrate against it, found that the American position had no single decisive point. There was only the system, adapting, everywhere, all the time. At approximately 1100 ounce, the fog burned off. The P-47s arrived in waves and found the German armor exactly where the forward observers on the ground had been marking for 4 hours. Panthers that had spent the morning making careful individual kills against American Shermans now found the sky had become a precision weapon aimed specifically at them. The kill rate was savage and clinical. A German reinforcement column moving up the road through Coincourt was caught in open ground and destroyed in 8 minutes. Over 5 days of fighting in and around Aricourt, the German panzer brigades lost 86 tanks. The 4th Armored Division lost 25. The mathematics that had once seemed to condemn American armor to a war of acceptable attrition had been inverted so completely that the German commanders who survived the battle were left trying to explain to their superiors what had happened. General von Manteuffel was an honest officer, careful and intelligent. He survived the war and wrote about what he had seen at Aricourt with the precision of a man who has had years to think about an uncomfortable truth. American forces, he wrote, had developed a method of combined combat. Artillery, armor, aviation, and infantry operating as a single integrated system that could not be disrupted at any single point because destroying one element immediately activated another. There was no single decisive point. There was only the machine. When the smoke cleared over the Lorraine Plateau on September 22, 1944, the burned-out wrecks of German armor stretched across 6 miles of French farmland. The math was no longer in Germany's favor. It would never be again. We speak of the Second World War in the grammar of hardware. The Tiger, the Zero, the Bismarck, the V2. The B-2. We remember the weapons because weapons are visible. They are tangible, photographable, the kind of thing that fills museums and commands genuine awe even in defeat, even 80 years later. Germany's engineering remains astonishing. The Tiger tank, in the conditions for which it was designed, was the finest ground weapon the war produced. Its engineers were not wrong about what they had made, and it lost. Not because American engineers eventually built a tank that could beat it in a straight fight, though the final Sherman variants came closer than the early ones, and the M26 Pershing that arrived in 1945 could meet a Tiger on something approaching equal terms. The Tiger lost because America built something no tank can engage, a learning system that found every vulnerability and closed around it from every direction simultaneously. The lesson is not about armor plate or muzzle velocity. It is about the nature of organized human effort in any domain, the institution that can look at failure honestly, extract the lesson without protecting its own ego, and distribute that knowledge across its entire structure faster than the opponent can adapt. That institution will defeat any collection of superior hardware. This is as true in medicine as in war. It is as true in commerce as in combat. The organization that learns faster wins. Every time. The machinery is secondary. The Tiger crews who faced American infantry at Morton, who drove into the system at Aricourt, were not inferior men. Many of them were exceptional, brave, technically skilled, committed to their mission with a dedication that deserves acknowledgement precisely because they were defeated by something they could not overcome through courage alone. They fought for an institution that had stopped learning how to adapt, led by commanders who could not question doctrine, inside a hierarchy that punished the wrong failure and rewarded the wrong loyalty. They met an army that had been humiliated at Kasserine Pass, that had watched its soldiers run and its tanks burn and its officers lose control, that had looked at all of that without flinching and asked, in the cold, practical, unsentimental way that armies ask questions when they understand that the alternative to asking, "What did we do wrong? And how do we build a system that makes it impossible to do it that same way twice?" Germany had the finest tank in the world. It was defeated by infantry that had learned to hunt it. Systems that learn cannot be beaten by hardware that doesn't.